Welcome to TelecomTV. My name is Tony Chan. With me today is Phll Robb from the Linux Foundation. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you very much, Tony.
I understand that you have many hats and that you're working both with OpenDaylight and Linux Foundation. Perhaps you can explain your different roles.
Sure. So I've been with OpenDaylight since its beginning. I began there actually as the Director of Operations. And at that time, I also had a role inside the Linux Foundation as well as a Director of Networking Solutions. We brought a lot of different networking projects on, and I'm always trying to lead the technical communities when they're first forming and then getting them into a stable state. And that role has expanded recently because we just continue to get more and more networking and orchestration projects into the Linux Foundation. So I took over as the Executive Director of OpenDaylight in March of this year, and at that time I also took on a VP role as the Vice President of Networking, of Operations actually, of Networking and Orchestration projects at the Linux Foundation.
Open source has become almost, I guess, the trend for networking these days. There's so many projects and there's so many initiatives being there. As, I guess, the underlying organization powering a lot of these projects, what is Linux Foundation's kind of role and contribution to that whole trend?
To that ecosystem? Yeah, and it is definitely the case. I think networking as an industry, starting about 4 years ago with the dawn of OpenDaylight, really started to explore what open source could do for them to become a significantly more agile industry. They had been using strictly the standards bodies as a way of organizing and creating interoperability between all of the vendors and ultimately all of the operators prior to that. But the evolution of technology was just moving too slowly for them. They recognized that with 3G to 4G and now 4G to 5G, there's an entire re-architecture of the way networks are being built that has to be done. A lot of the organizations talk about the softwareization, or just a lot of software that has to be implemented to be serving the same functions that had been done by hardware appliances. And we're to the point where the quantity of software that's necessary to be able to do that is really huge. But the good news is there are a lot of platforms from which different organizations can build upon, and those platforms are being done in open source.
Okay.
So the Linux Foundation, and we're doing this more than just networking, it is really the case as an industry is looking to do their next generation of activity. There's a foundation of software on top of which everybody needs to build. And doing that collaboratively and together, sharing in the cost and the development of the foundation lets everybody get to the interesting parts, the 20% differentiation as opposed to the 80% of the core software that's necessary to be done. It lets everybody get there much less expensively, much faster, and with somewhat of a guarantee of interoperability because that foundation software is all the same.
Okay. You mentioned interoperability, and within telcos, I mean, there's always a very severe concern about interoperability. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the targets, one of the missions of the OPNFV is to enable this kind of interoperability testing and engagement. Coming from Linux, who's 25-year history, how do you kind of balance interoperability and vendor and open source?
Well, it really underpins interoperability. We learned a long time ago that no matter how hard an architect tries to create a standard, the implementers always find gaps. They always find corner cases that weren't quite thought through. And it used to be the case, 20 years ago. It was common for different vendors to actually all buy the same protocol stack, for example, from a third party. And then they guaranteed interoperability because even though the spec wasn't perfect, that one implementation was consistent. And so all of the vendors that used it, by and large, had interoperability because even the bugs were compatible. Again, starting about 20 years ago, the advocacy of open source, and using that as the protocol implementation or the reference implementation for a protocol started to become commonplace, and we actually watched those vendors who were doing the protocol stacks kind of fade away at that time. And so open source became the standard platform, or the standard reference architecture, or standard reference implementation rather, for that software. And now we're just seeing more and more pieces of the stack use the same principle.
Okay. I think OpenDaylight is referred to as an upstream source for OPNFV. Do you think OPNFV has a role to play in kind of bringing multiple upstream providers into the fold and creating an ecosystem that uses all the parts to create a solution?
Absolutely, absolutely. That was one of the great goals of OPNFV, was to find a place where operators and carriers could identify what were the shortcomings in the upstream projects, and then work closely with those upstream projects, putting resources in those upstream projects to implement those features, and then bring them back down into the OPNFV environment to test that across those different open source components, the solution that they were looking to implement was actually doing what it was supposed to do. And that's by far the best thing that OPNFV has done in its history, is drive those features into the upstream projects, and they have a very robust set of labs and testing infrastructure to ensure across the different platforms, across the different implementations, be it different versions of Linux, be it SUSE, Canonical, Red Hat as an example, across those different flavors of open source foundational software, that those features are being implemented correctly and consistently.
I had this discussion with multiple members of attendees of this event, and it's about 5G and the ongoing standardization of 5G. And although a lot of people focus on the radio part, but there is also a new standard for the core network, and it seems virtualization is going to play a critical role in that. But so much of the virtualization work now is being done in open source. How do you kind of marry open source with a formal 5G standard?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we've been watching this, right? I mean, the need to be able to have a programmable network, the need to be able to quickly create routes, quickly create network slices, are part of the underpinning foundation that 5G needs to be built on. The ability to get compute resources very close to the edge, because the latency that is required in 5G is so small. Those are aspects of this new network that NFV in particular is built to do. Having the ability to generate different virtual functions that are close to the edge or in the core, wherever, ultimately across the entire network where the service needs to be constructed. The agility to be able to do that, to spin them up, to scale them out, to bring them back down, those are all aspects of a functional architecture that has to be in place to enable the interesting things that 5G brings beyond just the higher bandwidth. So all of those components are pieces that we're seeing being constructed in open source collaboratively across the vendor ecosystem and the operator ecosystem, again, so that we can get to that as quickly as possible. ONAP is another project that I'm very heavily involved in. We're just spinning up the community now. Actually, last week was the meeting where we actually approved a bunch of the projects that will be targeted towards the first release. And it is an implementation, so to speak, of, by and large, all of the components that are in that testing stack that we talked about from OPNFV, from orchestration and management, through the controller space, through data plane acceleration, down through the virtual switches. All of that actually is part of an ONAP implementation, as well as a virtual infrastructure manager like OpenStack. Those are all the pieces that play in that full stack of ONAP, and that is about deploying and managing end-to-end services using VNFs across your network.